Hi everybody, thanks for listening, watching, whatever. I often get asked, in fact I very often get asked, how I became so obsessed, really, with the subject of the Battle of Britain, fighter pilots, the Spitfire, casualties, and what drives somebody to completely focus their life on something like this. So I thought it might be useful if I actually explained all that, and then if anybody else wants to know, I can give them a link to the video. So I suppose my interest in history started with my now sadly departed mother, Janet, who used to take me around Worcester Cathedral in a pushchair even, and show me the knights' effigies, which absolutely fascinated me. And going into the old Woolworth store in Worcester, where I grew up, there was a big pegboard covered in model planes, and I was fascinated by the green and brown camouflage and the blue and red roundels. And as also, my uncle, my mother's brother, he made large-scale flying models, especially Spitfire, and Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs and Hurricanes and Mustangs. And he had a huge collection of these things. And there was always something being built on the table at my grandmother's house. So this was right from as far back as I can remember, really. And my mum loved books and used to read Ladybird history books to me. And I was absolutely taken up by this idea that you could pick up a book and be transported back through time to be riding with Alexander the Great and his great Greek army across the Persian plains, or you could be with Nelson at Trafalgar, or whatever you chose to be or imagine or relate to, depending on which book you picked up. So I suppose that's really where it all started. And when I was 3 years old, we moved to Margaret Road in St. John's in Worcester. And our neighbour, John Anthony, was a sailor in the First and Second World War. And the Anthonys talked about the war a lot. And in fact, Mrs. Anthony's mother, old Mrs. Bolt, lived with them, who was a Victorian. Old Gran, as I used to call her, fascinated me with her fox furs and things, and she just looked like she'd stepped out of another time, which I suppose she had. And before I even went to infant school, I used to sit there and say, come on, old Gran, can you tell me about the olden days? Which, of course, she loved to do. And her husband, who was dead by then, he served on HMS Iron Duke at the Battle of Jutland, and we used to talk about all those things. And I was fascinated. But there was a bit of a juxtaposition because my great-grandmother was still alive then, and her husband, my maternal great-grandfather, Private Herbert Smith, was missing in action at Gallipoli in 1915. And there was a photograph of him, which I now own in my office, above her fireplace. And I wanted to know who he was. And they said, oh, it's Mum's granddad. I said, well, where is he? Well, he's missing. Well, what do you mean he's missing? Well, he was killed in the First World War. Well, what happened to him? Well, nobody knows. And I just couldn't compute that somebody could be killed and they're missing and nobody knows what happened to them. And there was always a bit of a sadness about that house and about my great-grandmother, who died in probably 65, 66. So, added to that, her son, my beloved maternal grandfather, Herbert Henry Smith, was a grenadier, 1928 to 31, served with the colours, then was on the reserve list. So in 1939, just before war breaks out and the country's mobilised, Bert is called back up at the age of early 30s with a wife and two daughters, my mum, Janet, being the eldest. So off 1st Guards Brigade go to France, and ultimately when the shooting started, they pivot forward into Belgium in May 1940 with the British Expeditionary Force, and a huge battle takes place on the River Escaut on 21st of May 1940, in which Lance Corporal Harry Nichols, the Battalion Grenadier Guards, wins the Victoria Cross, pushes the Germans back across the river, by which time my granddad had been wounded and captured in hand-to-hand fighting on the canal bank. Harry Nichols was so badly wounded he was left dead, and picked up by the Germans that night after the BEF had withdrawn. And he and my granddad spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. Now, my granddad refused point blank to ever discuss the war, and I could tell that these experiences of war were very different. That there was Mr. Anthony, a sailor, happy to talk about the war, and he talked about the war a lot, and he talked more about Spitfires and Malta and things like that than he did about his own war, if you like, which is not untypical. But my granddad was quite withdrawn and lived out in the country. Nothing bothered him. And that sort of fascinated me, that there was definitely a juxtaposition there. There was something about this war experience that wasn't consistent. And also, of course, at the time, growing up in the 1960s, as a generation of schoolboys, we were really, I think, because it's Cold War time, we were being groomed to fight another war, if necessary. And consequently, all of our toys were warlike, Action Man, Airfix models, plastic models, guns, helmets, sort of child uniform stuff, toy soldiers. And I bought into all of this. And then there were the comics, the Victor, the Valiant, the Warlord, Commando. And I absolutely was obsessed with the Second World War. The Second World War has always been my huge interest. Not so much the First World War, I have to say. I don't know why, but the Second World War, the rise of Hitler, the whole experience of it, the home front, the politics, the diplomacy, the obviously the military history side of it, but a very broad interest in it. And of course, we were also brainwashed by the relentless barrage of war films. So, Reach for the Sky, Angels 1-5, 633 Squadron, all of these fantastic films, they were on the TV constantly. And then in 1969, the epic Battle of Britain is released, which is in colour and largely involves real airplanes, unlike some of the other films which relied heavily on models. And this was in colour on the big screen. And my dad took me to see it. And bear in mind that the film had been probably a couple of years at least in the making. And it had been featured in countless newspaper articles, magazine articles. There was all kinds of promotional merchandise. We had Battle of Britain bubblegum cards that we all collected with stills from the film on the one side and newspaper front pages of the time on the reverse. There were all of these books connected with the film, colouring books, postcard collecting books. There were dinky models, the Spitfire, the die-cast Stuka that dropped a bomb that you put a cap in and it exploded. And this was absolutely wonderful stuff. So when I actually saw the Battle of Britain film for the first time, it was absolutely, I suppose in today's parlance, a utterly gobsmacking moment. And I was 7 or 8 years old, and I was just hooked. I was already hooked. I mean, I was building model aircraft from the age of about 4, and totally hooked on the whole thing. But the Battle of Britain film in colour really brought it all together. Now, when I was 10, my dad, who was Indian, but unusually was a Quaker, we were coming back from London. I've been on a business trip with him. And I was burbling on and on and on because I just read Paul Brickhill's Reach for the Sky. And I think Dad had had enough of this. And he pulled in to a lay-by next to the cemetery at Morton in the Marsh in Gloucestershire and said, I've got something to show you. So I followed him out of the car and we went into the cemetery. and there were about 50 odd, perhaps more, aircrew grade. And I was again gobsmacked. This wasn't Richard Todd pretending to be Guy Gibson or Kenneth Moore acting Douglas Bader. This was real. These were real pilots, navigators, air gunners. And what I know now is they were from the Wellington Bomber Operational Training Unit airfield that was across the road, which is now the Fire Brigade Training School, plus largely a housing estate. And I thought it was amazing. And the one thing that struck me and has still stayed with me is a lot of those aircrew, they were from the Commonwealth. They were from Australia, New Zealand, Canada. And I remember thinking even then, these boys are a long way from home. And I wonder whether their families have ever been out here to see these graves. I wonder what they look like, these people. How did they die? And are they remembered? And all of these things were going through my head as a 10-year-old. And that's really where the research started. So with a great primary source next door in Mr. and Mrs. Anthony, I was able to start making notes and talking to people. And in those days, of course, your grandparents had been in it, your other relatives had been in the war, your neighbours, your teachers. And I started talking to people about the war. I wanted to know what it was like back there. So that really is where it started. And then I suppose by the time I was about 17 or 18, I was looking at local presentation Spitfires and local graves, military graves, things like that. And by the time of the very early 1980s, around about 1980, The Battle of Britain Then and Now, edited by Winston Ramsey, came out, this encyclopedic reference work about aircraft and aircrew casualties during the Battle of Britain. And that was another crystallising moment, looking at that, looking at the young faces and the graves. And I'm thinking, well, this is exactly what I'm doing in a different place, not in the Battle of Britain land, but in the Midlands. And this is extraordinary. I am not alone. And then I think probably 1980, Flight Paths magazine began. And in those days, it was very heavily focused on historical articles, more so, I think, than the vintage warbird movement and aircraft restoration and things, which it perhaps is today. I don't know. I haven't read it for years. But aviation archaeology had sort of started with the Battle of Britain film, actually. And it came to a wider audience when the Battle of Britain Then and Now was published. And I thought this was amazing. I'd absolutely love to get involved with this. And I walked into a model shop in Worcester, and there was a notice on the door from one Andrew Long wanting to start the Worcestershire Aviation Archaeology Group. And I thought, oh yeah, I'd love to get involved with that. So I wrote to this Andy Long, almost apologising for the fact that I was 19 or 20 and I wasn't around in the war, but I was passionately interested. And he rang me up. And we had a good old chat, and I was absolutely astonished at his, again, encyclopedic knowledge of telling me things that I had no idea that happened, of aircraft crashes, over 350 in Worcestershire alone, which were mainly training crashes. I was absolutely astonished. And I was even more astonished when Andy told me he was only 14. So we go back a long way, Andy Long and I, and we're still great friends today, all these years later. So we used to go out ferreting about the local sort of history, the local crashes and things like that. But then, after I finished my A-levels, I joined the police. I didn't want to go to university then. I wanted to see the world. And my dad was a magistrate, and cutting the long story short, I ended up joining West Mercia Police and was in the police for 22 years, during which I served as a detective and a community police officer, all sorts of things. And I actually think, looking back, that being a police officer was a much better training ground to be a historian than actually going to do a history degree, because I've done both now. And being a police officer taught me the skills of communication, confidence, social confidence, interviewing people, extracting information, writing statements, writing circumstances for court, and thoroughly investigating things and winning people's confidence so that they want to talk to you. And I can't think of a better training ground than that. And I think that the most important thing, I watched something recently. There's been a historical discovery in the Wars of the Roses period, and it's all, oh my word, I spoke to the police and they explained to me about things being evidence-led. So the whole thing has been evidence. Well, it should be evidence-led anyway, shouldn't it? If you're a historian, the worst possible thing a historian can do is have a preconceived idea or thesis and manipulate the facts to fit that, to fit their narrative. That is wrong, wrong, wrong. It's got to be driven by evidence. And I learnt that in the police. And I don't care what anybody says about the police now. I've got my own views about the police. My son's a serving officer, and I know it's tough out there. But that's what it taught me back in 1982 onward. And I wouldn't have it any other way, actually. So that was it. So I was in the police. And during that time, again, after I'd worked at Redditch in Worcestershire for a while, I got posted to the sleepy backwater of Malvern, which I wasn't too happy about at the time, as I recall, 1985. And I bumped into Andy Long again. And he said, did you know there was a Spitfire crashed just outside Malvern, a Polish Battle of Britain pilot? And I didn't know that. And that was the second ping, absolute light bulb moment. And together, we decided that we were going to set up the Malvern Spitfire team to research, excavate and recover the remains of that aircraft and research the stories of all the various pilots who flew it. And of course, Frank Surma himself, Battle of Britain pilot, Hurricane pilot, missing over the channel, flying Spitfires with the Polish Northolt wing on the 8th of November 1941, which was a tragic operation. We lost 16 Spitfires that day. The last big operation, thankfully, of 1941. And it was an extraordinary thing. We weren't very old, so I think I was probably about 25, and Andy was in his teens still. And I think people took us to their hearts, really. We gathered around us a great support network of incredible people. Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson, Group Captain Peter Townsend, Geoffrey Quill, Alex Henshaw, Sir Hugh Dundas, Sir Dennis Crowley-Minnick, Sir Archie Winskill, Lady Barder, Lady Dowdy, Sir Christopher Foxy Noss. I mean, the support that we had and the list of patrons read like a who's who of the Battle of Britain and the Spitfire story. I mean, it was really amazing. And ultimately, we did recover the remains of the aircraft. There wasn't a huge amount left, but it was a massive event at which we also had a memorial unveiled to Frank Surma, which was the first individual memorial to a Polish fighter pilot in the UK at the time. And that was in 1987. And it was unveiled by squadron leaders Gandhi Drabinski and Ludwig Martel, who were wonderful people. And we had a ceremony afterwards at the Polish Air Force Association headquarters in London, at which they made me an honorary Pole, which I accepted on behalf of everybody who'd been involved in the team and involved in the project. And some people thought it was a one-off project. It wasn't. That's where it started. During the research into the aircraft and the stories of the pilots that had killed it, flown it rather, that brought us into contact with the families of some that were killed, some that were missing, with survivors. And of course, the majority of these people, they're not famous. They are what Peter Fox, who flew Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain, described himself and his friends as also-rans. And it was the also-rans that I was really interested in, because the famous pilots like Johnny, like Sir Hugh Dundas and so on, they'd written their own memoirs and published them, or other people have written books about them, like Larry Forrester's book on Stanford Tuck and Brickhill's book on Barder. But these people, they'd gone home after the war and they got other careers to sort out. They got families to bring up. The war was over. And they put away their logbooks and their medals and their photographs and their memorabilia in a shoebox under the bed or up in the attic. And there it stayed. And when we came on the scene, it coincided with their retirement. So for the first time, a lot of these people actually had time to sit down and reflect upon the past. And I think also it was possibly difficult for them to talk to their own children in certain cases that just didn't relate to it. And that generation, my mother's generation, distanced themselves from the war, I think. And it was easier to talk to me, I think. And traveling around the country, interviewing Battle of Britain pilots, interviewing the widows, the brothers, the sisters of casualties. It was absolutely, totally absorbing. And meanwhile, I stayed in the police, which was a bit like a student working in McDonald's, really, only so that I could pursue my passion. And by 1987-ish, I was writing articles in aviation magazines. Of course, social media didn't exist in those days, so we had no means of sharing things like we do today, like I'm talking to you today, and this is going to go out on YouTube, or we've got social media, we've got Facebook, we've got Twitter, we've got all of this stuff today, which just didn't exist back then. So you had to do it the hard way. You had to publish things. You had to be able to write, you had to be able to research, and you had to be able to present your work to an editor in such a way that they will be sufficiently impressed to publish. So that was quite a journey as well for somebody who was not part of the publishing industry or history industry or anything like that. So it was all a steep learning curve. But then I was always fascinated by the story of Brian Lane, and there'll be a video being uploaded shortly about Brian Lane, Squadron Leader Brian Lane, commander of 19 Squadron for most of the Battle of Britain, extraordinary individual. I'm not going to go over the story again now, but a famous photograph of him captivated me as a child, and I later discovered who he was and that he was missing, so that really resonated with me. And the story of Brian and 19 Squadron became my first book in 1990, Spitfire Squadron. And that was an amazing experience, meeting the survivors and the relatives of casualties. People like George Unwin, absolute legend, Jock Cunningham, Frank Brinsden came over from New Zealand, Jimmy Coward came over from Australia, and the ground crews, Fred Roberts, John Mill. I mean, this was an amazing experience, and I think I was about 29 then, so really not very old. And then the books just went from there. And of course, the book about Spitfire R6644 and the Frantic Surma story, that was book number 2. And so it rolled. And during this time, I was accumulating this huge archive of correspondence. Of course, that's how we used to do it in those days. I didn't have great means. I've never been attached to a museum or had a sponsor. So everything I've done has been out of my own pocket. People talk about profits and things like that. There's no profits doing this. I have spent thousands and countless thousands of pounds on my research and what I do, trying to make people happy, really, trying to record the stories of their relatives and publish them, and maybe make some sense out of the fact that they were killed and how, like in my own family, those casualties still reverberate down the generation. So it had to be fairly low budget. So there were trips around the country, and indeed there still are. And largely it was through correspondence, as I say. So I used to write 1,000 letters a year, and that went on for about 15 years. So I've got one half of the archive, which is I've got all of the replies, but not my letters that went out, unfortunately. I wish I'd kept copies of those, but again, I was a busy police officer, I'd got a young family, and you could only do so much. But that archive is now unique of letters and memoirs that people have written up for me, and that's what's enabled me to use in my work original first-hand accounts that are unique, and they were not, they were collated the hard way. If anybody thinks that anybody knocks on your door and goes, Dilip Sarkar, I'm going to make you a best-selling author, and you're going to be able to meet extraordinary people and do all of these things, and they are magic wand. Doesn't work like that. I'm going to talk in another video about the publishing process, the research process, and really people need to have their eyes open about the blood, the sweat and the tears and the sacrifices actually behind the scenes that go into doing something like this. But anyway, there we are. That's how it all started, and I would never have imagined being where I am today. So in 2003, Lady Barder and Sir Alan Smith, who was one of Barder's wingmen, nominated me for my MBE for services to aviation history. So that was a great honour to accept that for, well, again, on behalf of everybody who'd supported me. And that's why I use those letters after my name. Some people don't. I do, because it is entirely relevant to what I do. And because of the people who supported that nomination, I think it's only respectful to use it. And then in 2000, I left the police in 2005. And in 2006, my great friend and mentor and inspiration, Dr. Alfred Price, nominated me for a fellowship of the Royal Historical Society, which was another great moment, because it's a peer-reviewed process. And I was very proud that Alfred put me through to that. And over the years, I've done lots of different things. After the police, I went to university at last, did a history degree, got a first, did a bit of teaching, A-level modern history, carried on writing. I've always written concurrently with policing, university. Then I was head of a national enforcement setup for 8 years, and again, carried on writing. Switched around publishers, set up my own companies back in the 90s and the 2000s, Ramrock Publications. We used to do huge events, huge book signings with up to 40 Battle of Britain pilots there on occasions, and some incredible personalities, British and German. Absolutely astonishing. People used to come from all over the world to these events, no longer possible now for obvious reasons. And Victory Books. And then I wrote for Amberley Publishing for a while. And about 5 years ago, I moved over to Pen and Sword. And Martin Mace, my commissioning editor, is a very close friend of mine. We work together hand in glove, and it's the best move I ever made. And I probably, with the books that are queued for publication, it must be over 60 now. So that's the journey, really. For somebody who was from an ordinary background, I was a police officer, and here I am now. So writing the official history of the Battle of Britain in 8 volumes for the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust. It'll be round about 1 million words in total. I've completed 6 volumes, and I'm about to start volume 7. And the first 2 volumes are available. The Gathering Storm, Prelude to the Spitfire Summer of 1940, and The Breaking Storm, which covers the period 10th of July 1940 to the 12th of August 1940. So this is a day by day, minute by minute, 360 look at the Battle of Britain in every respect, not just the air fighting, although that is dissected in minute detail, but the personalities, the home front, the experience, the army, the navy, the coastal command, bollard command, as much as you can cram into how many words you've actually got to be able to use. So that's where I am. And now we are in a position where we have set up this YouTube channel specifically to promote the project and to share the love of what I do with all of you brilliant people. And I'd like to thank Shane Greer, who's helped me set this up. Without Shane, I couldn't do it, because I am a technophobe, whereas Shane understands everything to do with this, which is brilliant, extremely helpful. So thank you, Shane, and thank you to everybody who's subscribed to the channel and everybody who's watched these videos or listen to the podcast that we put up a couple of days ago. We'll be doing some more of those as well. And it enables us to get out and share things with you in such a way that we haven't been able to do before. You know, in the days prior to social media and YouTube, things were much more difficult. So I think it's great. I'm not getting any younger, and I would like there to be a record of what I have done in terms of the people I've met. They are wonderful people, the wartime veterans, the families of casualties, and that's really why I want to do these videos, and that's why I've written my books. It certainly isn't for the money. If anybody thinks that, forget it. It doesn't work like that. I wish it did, but it really, really doesn't. You know, you have a passion to share these stories and record these stories, and that is actually what it's all about. So thanks for listening. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know any comments, good or bad, under the video on the comment section. If you'd like to subscribe to the page, please do, to the channel, and be a part of our community that we're trying to build, and then we can share the love together. So that's who I am, Dilip Sarkar, and I look forward very much to talking to you all again soon. Thanks for listening.